So we finally received a name of the Hollywood deepfake company that we can confirm Turning Point USA was meeting with following Charlie's tragic passing. We're going to show you what this company is capable of, and I'm going to allow you to draw your own conclusions. And lastly, the admission from Paramount Tactical, Gary Melton, that one of the children in Erika's Fort Huachuca alibi photo is not hers, is not a...
Something strange has taken over the internet again, and this time nobody can agree on what's real anymore. It started with a single claim online, a short post, a blurry leaked screenshot. No verified source, no confirmation. Just a message that instantly split the internet in half. Something is not matching in the timeline. Within hours, that one line turned into a wildfire. Clips were pulled from old interviews. Photos were re-examined frame by frame. Entire conversations were resurfaced from years ago and reinterpreted like hidden evidence that nobody noticed at the time. And at the center of it all is a story that's now being described online as the most confusing narrative collapse people have ever seen. Some users believe there's nothing here at all, just social media spiraling out of control, connecting dots that were never meant to be connected. But others are convinced something deeper is happening behind the scenes. They point to silence, to deleted posts, to interviews that suddenly feel different when rewatched today. They say the reactions don't match the explanations, and the explanations don't match the timeline. And the longer this goes on, the more intense it becomes. Because now it's not just about one claim anymore. It's about trust. It's about whether public stories are ever exactly what they seem. And it's about how quickly an entire online audience can turn uncertainty into certainty just by repeating the same theory over and over again. But here's where things take a turn nobody expected. A new wave of analysis has started circulating, claiming there are contradictions in old appearances, inconsistencies in past statements, and unexplained gaps in the timeline that no one can fully account for. None of it is confirmed. None of it is verified, but that hasn't stopped it from spreading. And now, the biggest question being asked across every platform is simple. Are people uncovering hidden truth? Or are they watching a story being built out of fragments that were never connected in the first place? Because according to the latest wave of online discussion, this might not be a story about one event at all. It might be about how the internet creates its own reality, one clip, one claim, and one theory at a time. And just when you think it can't escalate any further, a second wave of evidence suddenly appears online, and everything starts again. To understand why this situation exploded the way it did, you have to understand the environment it came from. Because this wasn't just one clip. It wasn't just one post. It was the result of years of online tension building inside a space where politics, media influence, public image, and internet speculation constantly overlap, and sometimes collide in ways nobody can fully control. At the center of the conversation sits a well-known political media ecosystem, one built around public speaking, campus events, digital influence, and strong ideological branding. Over time, the people connected to it became more than just commentators or organizers. They became symbols. And symbols, once they exist long enough online, stop being treated like people. They become narratives. Within that environment, public figures are constantly being interpreted, reinterpreted, and reframed depending on what side of the internet is telling the story. Supporters build admiration, critics build suspicion, and the algorithm amplifies whichever version triggers the strongest emotional reaction. That's the backdrop this entire controversy emerges from. For years, audiences watched carefully curated public appearances, interviews, speeches, and social media moments. Everything looked structured, polished, intentional. But as always in internet culture, the deeper the public image becomes, the more people begin searching for what might exist behind it. Old interviews started resurfacing. Past relationships were re-examined. Early career moments were pulled back into circulation and viewed through a completely different lens than when they were first released. And slowly, a second narrative began forming online that existed parallel to the official one. In this alternate narrative, nothing is accidental. Every connection has meaning. Every relationship has timing. Every public statement has a hidden context. And every inconsistency becomes evidence of something larger happening beneath the surface. This is where figures like media commentators, influencers, and political voices begin getting pulled into the same speculative ecosystem. Not because there is proof of wrongdoing, but because the internet tends to merge everything connected to a public ecosystem into one single unfolding story. Once that happens, boundaries disappear. A past interview becomes a clue. A social media post becomes a signal. A timing coincidence becomes intentional alignment. And suddenly, the story is no longer about isolated moments. It becomes about pattern recognition. Even normal life events get reframed inside that system. A career move becomes strategic. A public appearance becomes symbolic. A silence becomes suspicious. And the more people engage with the narrative, the more real it feels, regardless of whether any of it is actually confirmed. What makes this particular wave of discussion so explosive is not any single claim, but the speed at which interpretations are spreading. Short clips circulate without context. Old footage is re-uploaded with new captions. Screenshots are shared without origin. And every layer added by users makes the story feel more structured than it actually is. At this stage, the internet is no longer just reacting to information. It is actively building a story from fragments. And once that happens, the original truth, whatever it was, starts to fade behind the noise. People involved in the wider ecosystem have faced this before. Public figures in political media spaces are often used as reference points in broader online debates, where audiences project meaning onto them that goes far beyond what was ever publicly stated. That's how narratives evolve, not through one single revelation, but through thousands of interpretations stacking on top of each other. And by the time the conversation reaches mainstream attention, the original context is often already gone, replaced instead by a version of the story shaped entirely by online repetition, emotional framing, and viral speculation loops. Which is exactly why this situation feels so unstable right now. Because nobody is reacting to one confirmed event. They are reacting to dozens of fragmented interpretations of events that may or may not be connected at all. And in that kind of environment, even silence starts to feel like part of the story. Even absence becomes meaningful. Even uncertainty becomes fuel. And as more people begin digging through older clips, interviews, and interactions, the narrative doesn't slow down. It expands, pulling more names in, pulling more timelines apart, and setting the stage for what the internet is now calling the first major turning point in the discussion. A moment that, depending on who you ask, either reveals everything or proves nothing at all. And that's exactly where the next phase begins. It started with something that didn't even look important at first. A short clip resurfaced online, buried in older content, the kind of thing nobody pays attention to until the internet decides it deserves attention. At normal speed, it looked harmless. A casual moment, a familiar voice, a familiar setting, nothing out of place, nothing alarming, just another archived piece of content that should stayed forgotten. But that's not how the internet works anymore. Someone slowed it down, someone zoomed in, someone added a caption. And suddenly, everything changed. Within hours, the same clip was everywhere, but now it wasn't the same clip anymore. It had become a key moment, a missing detail, a piece of the puzzle. And once that label sticks, there's no going back. People began replaying it again and again, not because anything new was happening, but because they were convinced something hidden was happening underneath it. That's where the conflict really began. Not in reality, but in interpretation. One group insisted it was nothing more than overanalysis. They pointed out how easy it is for context to disappear online, how a normal conversation can look suspicious when stripped of its surroundings. But another group wasn't listening anymore. They said this wasn't about one clip, it was about a pattern. And once they said the word pattern, the conversation stopped being casual. It turned into investigation mode. Old interviews were pulled back into circulation. Archived posts were resurfaced. Screenshots started circulating with highlighted sections and bold captions pointing out inconsistencies. And suddenly, people who had never cared about the situation were now deeply invested in decoding it. Because the more they looked, the more questions they found. Not answers, questions. One interview contradicted another. One timeline didn't align perfectly with a previously accepted version of events. A detail mentioned in passing years ago didn't match a later retelling. Individually, none of it meant much. But together, it started to feel like something was shifting. Like the story people thought they understood wasn't as stable as they believed. And that's when the emotional temperature of the situation changed. It wasn't curiosity anymore, it was suspicion. And suspicion spreads faster than facts ever will. Soon, social media wasn't just discussing the situation. It was dissecting it in real time. Every frame of video was being analyzed like evidence in a courtroom. Every sentence from past interviews was being treated like testimony. People started building timelines on their own. Not official ones, not verified ones, their own versions. And once that happens, reality fragments. Different communities began forming completely different interpretations of the same events. One group believed everything still made perfect sense and that the chaos online was just amplification bias. Another group believed there were too many inconsistencies to ignore anymore. And a third group didn't fully commit to either side. They just kept digging, convinced that something important was buried under all the noise. That third group is where things started escalating. Because they weren't arguing, they were collecting screenshots, clips, quotes, deleted posts, old photos, anything that could possibly connect to something bigger. And once enough pieces were collected, people began doing what the internet always does when it thinks it's uncovered something. It starts building a narrative. Not necessarily a true one, but a compelling one. And compelling narratives spread faster than anything else. At this point, even people close to the situation, whether directly or indirectly connected, started becoming part of the online conversation. Not because they said anything new, but because silence itself started being interpreted. In this phase of internet storytelling, silence is never neutral. It is always assigned meaning. If someone doesn't respond, people assume they're avoiding something. If someone responds too strongly, people assume they're covering something up. There is no correct reaction once a narrative reaches this stage. Every move becomes evidence for one side or the other. And that's exactly what happened here. The situation stopped being about what was actually said or shown. It became about what people believed was missing. Then came the moment that pushed everything into its first real turning point. A new detail surfaced, not officially confirmed, but widely shared. It didn't introduce a brand new accusation. Instead, it changed the way people were interpreting everything that came before it. And that's far more powerful. Because once interpretation shifts, every old piece of information changes meaning. The same interview that once looked normal now looked rehearsed. The same timeline that once felt consistent now looked questionable. The same relationships that once seemed stable now felt strategically positioned. Nothing new had actually been proven. But perception had changed. And perception is what drives viral collapse. That's when the first real division became unavoidable. Supporters of the original narrative began pushing back harder, frustrated by what they saw as overreach and speculation. Meanwhile, critics doubled down, convinced that the pushback itself was proof that something deeper was being hidden. And in between those two extremes, the conversation became louder, messier, and increasingly emotional. People weren't just debating facts anymore. They were defending beliefs. And beliefs are much harder to change. By this stage, the story had already escaped its original boundaries. It wasn't contained to one platform anymore. It was everywhere. Clips were being remixed, reposted, reframed. Every repost added a new layer of interpretation, until the original context was almost unrecognizable. And yet the momentum kept growing. Because the internet doesn't slow down when something is unclear. It speeds up. And just when it felt like the situation couldn't get any more complicated, another wave of resurfaced content began circulating. This time, it wasn't just about contradictions in interviews or timelines. It was about relationships, connections, and overlapping histories that people claimed they had never noticed before. At first, it looked like coincidence. Then people started aligning dates. Then they started aligning appearances. Then they started asking whether certain individuals had been closer to the central figure of the story much earlier than publicly understood. And that question alone opened an entirely new layer of speculation. Because once people start questioning proximity, nothing stays simple anymore. Every friendship becomes suspicious. Every introduction becomes strategic. Every past connection becomes part of a possible hidden structure. And that's when the first twist fully locks in, not as a confirmed fact, but as a shared belief forming across online spaces. That the version of events people originally accepted may not be complete. And once that idea takes hold, there's no returning to the original narrative. Because now the audience isn't just watching the story unfold. They're actively rewriting it in real time. And the deeper they go, the more unstable everything becomes. Until one question starts echoing louder than all the others combined. If so much of this story feels unclear in hindsight, what else hasn't been seen yet? And that's where everything starts heading into the next stage. where speculation stops being casual and starts becoming something far more intense, far more organized, and far harder to ignore. The moment the conversation broke past the first layer of doubt, everything accelerated in a way nobody could control anymore. It didn't stay contained to niche discussions or small comment sections. It spilled into every corner of the internet like a flood that had finally found a weak point in the dam. At first it looked like just another wave of reposts. Familiar clips resurfacing again, familiar arguments repeating themselves. But something was different this time. The tone had changed. People weren't asking questions anymore. They were making declarations. That doesn't look like a coincidence. This timeline doesn't make sense anymore. There's more going on behind the scenes. And once language shifts from curiosity to certainty, the entire emotional weight of the story changes. That's when the escalation truly began. New accounts started appearing across platforms, each claiming to have context, inside understanding, or additional details that people were missing. None of them could be verified. But that didn't matter anymore, because the audience wasn't evaluating credibility at this stage. They were evaluating consistency with the narrative they already believed might be forming. And every new post either reinforced it or deepened suspicion. Then came the second wave. A completely different type of content started circulating. Screenshots, alleged leaks, blurred documents, voice notes with no clear origin. Each piece on its own looked incomplete. But together, they created the illusion of a larger structure. A pattern that seemed too coordinated to ignore. And that's where things took a darker turn. Because once people believe a pattern exists, they stop asking whether it is real. They start asking who built it and why. The discussion quickly shifted from isolated inconsistencies to broader claims about influence, control, and narrative shaping. People began revisiting older media appearances, not for entertainment, but for hidden meaning. Every phrase was analyzed, every pause was replayed, every gesture was reinterpreted. And suddenly, the story wasn't about one person anymore. It was about a system. That idea spread faster than anything else, because systems feel bigger than individuals. And anything that feels bigger becomes more believable, even without proof. At the same time, reactions from public-facing figures began entering the conversation, not through direct statements, but through indirect commentary, vague posts, and carefully worded messages that left room for interpretation. And that ambiguity only made things worse. Supporters of the original narrative saw these comments as unnecessary escalation. Critics saw them as indirect confirmation that something unusual was happening behind the scenes. Both sides became more entrenched. Neither side moved closer to understanding the other, and the gap between them kept widening. Then came the moment that pushed everything into full-scale controversy. A new reveal began circulating online. It didn't come from an official source. It didn't come with verification, but it came with timing. And timing in viral narratives often matters more than truth. The claim suggested that certain behind-the-scenes communications and organizational decisions may have been happening long before the public was aware of any internal tension. Nothing concrete was shown, but the implication alone was enough, because it reframed everything people thought they understood. Now older events were no longer seen as isolated. They were being reinterpreted as part of a longer chain of decisions. And once that idea took hold, the conversation shifted again. Now people weren't just analyzing personalities. They were analyzing structure. Who was positioned where? Who appeared close at specific moments? Who seemed to gain visibility after key transitions? It wasn't about direct evidence anymore. It was about perceived alignment. And perceived alignment is one of the most powerful drivers of online speculation. As the narrative escalated further, a second layer of content emerged, this time focused on technology, media, manipulation, and digital authenticity. AI-generated media, altered clips, and synthetic voice discussions began entering the conversation. Some users claimed certain visuals looked too clean. Others argued that editing tools today make everything suspicious if you look hard enough. But the presence of AI in the conversation changed the emotional temperature again. Because now the question wasn't just what happened. It became, can we even trust what we're seeing? And once that question enters, everything becomes unstable. Even real footage starts to feel uncertain. Even authentic moments begin to get reanalyzed through a lens of doubt. The internet entered a phase where nothing was fully trusted unless it was proven beyond doubt, and very little online ever meets that standard. Then came the most explosive shift yet. A fragmented claim began circulating, suggesting that multiple unrelated elements of the situation might be interconnected, not in a simple cause and effect way, but in a broader narrative chain that spans multiple people, events, and timelines. Again, nothing was confirmed, but the structure of the claim was what made it powerful. It didn't need to prove everything. It only needed to connect enough dots to feel plausible. And once viewers started mentally filling in gaps themselves, the story essentially became self-sustaining. Every new viewer interpreted it slightly differently. Every version added new assumptions. And those assumptions layered on top of each other until the narrative became something far larger than any original detail. At this point, even neutral observers couldn't ignore the scale of attention. The story had crossed from internet discussion into cultural controversy. And once that happens, it stops being controlled by facts. It starts being driven by momentum. But the most unexpected shift wasn't external. It was psychological. People began noticing their own reaction to the story changing over time. At first, they were skeptical, then curious, then invested, then convinced something important was being hidden. And that progression is what made the escalation so powerful. Because it wasn't just happening to the story. It was happening to the audience. And once people feel emotionally involved, they stop consuming information passively. They start defending their interpretation of it. That's when debates become arguments, and arguments become identity-driven. By the end of this phase, the situation had transformed completely from what it was at the beginning. What started as scattered online speculation had evolved into a layered, self-reinforcing narrative ecosystem. One side insisted everything was overblown. The other insisted too many things didn't add up to ignore. And between them, a massive audience watched, debated, and shared constantly, feeding the cycle without realizing it. But the most important development wasn't what had been proven. It was what people now believed could still be revealed next. Because stories like this, escalation doesn't end when answers arrive. It ends when the audience stops believing there are more questions left. And right now, that belief is still very far away. The moment the discussion reached peak visibility, everything stopped feeling like a niche internet debate and started feeling like a full-scale public phenomenon. It wasn't confined to one platform anymore. It was everywhere at once. Short clips were circulating on multiple apps, comment sections were overflowing, and reaction videos were appearing faster than anyone could keep track of. And what made it even more intense was the division. There was no middle ground left. People either believed the situation was being completely misinterpreted online, or they believed there were too many inconsistencies piling up to ignore anymore. And both sides were growing louder. On one side, supporters of the original public narrative pushed back strongly against the wave of speculation. They described the entire situation as a classic case of internet distortion, where isolated moments are taken out of context, exaggerated, and reshaped into something far bigger than reality. They pointed out how quickly narratives can spiral once edited clips and screenshots start circulating without verification. To them, the story was simple. People were connecting unrelated details and forcing them into a pattern that didn't actually exist. But even within that group, there was frustration. Because no matter how many times they tried to explain context, the counter-narrative kept spreading faster, and every attempt to shut it down only seemed to make it more visible. On the other side, critics of the public narrative felt completely the opposite. To them, this wasn't random internet noise. They believed the sheer volume of inconsistencies being discussed could not be dismissed so easily. They argued that when too many small details feel off, it stops being coincidence and starts becoming something worth questioning. And even though they couldn't agree on every detail, they shared one common belief. There were unanswered questions. And unanswered questions tend to grow louder over time, not quieter. Influencers and commentators quickly entered the conversation, each adding their own interpretation. Some took a skeptical stance, urging audiences not to jump to conclusions based on viral clips. Others leaned into the uncertainty, suggesting that the situation revealed how quickly public narratives can shift when online communities begin digging into archived content. And a smaller group stayed deliberately vague, carefully choosing words that hinted at more complexity than people realize, without making any direct claims. That ambiguity only fueled more engagement, because vague statements leave room for projection, and people tend to fill in blanks with whatever aligns with their existing suspicions. Reaction channels and commentary accounts played a massive role in amplifying the situation. Within hours, breakdown videos appeared analyzing everything from interview clips to timeline discussions. Some creators paused frames for hidden meaning. Others compared older content side by side with newer material. Even small inconsistencies in tone or phrasing were being treated as major discoveries. And as these videos gained traction, they began shaping the way audiences interpreted the situation. Not because they proved anything, but because they framed how people should look at it. And framing is often more influential than facts. Mainstream commentary circles reacted more cautiously. Some avoided the topic entirely, likely due to the sensitivity surrounding the claims being circulated online. Others briefly acknowledged the viral nature of the discussion, emphasizing the importance of verifying information before forming conclusions. But even those neutral responses were interpreted in different ways depending on the audience. To skeptics, it was responsible caution. To critics, it looked like avoidance. And once again, the lack of consensus only widened the gap. Meanwhile, social media platforms became the true center of the storm. Hashtags began trending. Clips were reposted in endless loops. Users were compiling timelines, summaries, and breakdown threads, attempting to organize the chaos into something understandable. But instead of clarity, it created fragmentation. Every version of the timeline looked slightly different depending on who constructed it. And that inconsistency only made people more determined to find the real one. Public sentiment also began shifting emotionally. At first, the tone was curiosity, then confusion, then suspicion, and eventually exhaustion mixed with obsession. People were spending hours following updates, reading threads, and watching breakdowns, not because they were fully convinced of anything, but because they felt like something important was unfolding in real time. And that feeling is powerful. Even without confirmation, the sense that something is happening behind the scenes is enough to keep audiences engaged indefinitely. Families, supporters, and close associates, at least those visible publicly, were also pulled into the conversation indirectly. Every silence was interpreted. Every vague statement was analyzed. Even unrelated posts were sometimes reframed through the lens of the ongoing discussion. And that created a pressure loop where no response felt safe, because speaking too much could fuel speculation, and speaking too little could fuel it even more. As the situation escalated, one thing became increasingly clear. This was no longer just about the original topic that sparked the conversation. It had evolved into something larger, a case study in how modern narratives form, spread, and sustain themselves in real time. A cycle driven not by official confirmation, but by engagement, interpretation, and emotional investment. And while supporters and critics continued arguing, a quieter shift was happening underneath everything. Audiences were becoming less interested in whether any single claim was true, and more interested in whether the entire structure of the story was stable. Because once people start questioning structure instead of details, the conversation becomes much harder to resolve. Every new piece of information doesn't answer the story. It expands it, and that expansion is exactly what keeps it alive. By the end of this phase, the reaction landscape had fully transformed. What started as isolated commentary had become a global debate ecosystem. Every platform had its own version of the story. Every community had its own interpretation. And every viewer had their own evolving theory about what might be going on. But despite all the noise, one thing stood out above everything else. No one felt like they had the full picture. And in viral narratives like this, that feeling is exactly what keeps everything going. By the time the story reached its final phase, the internet had already gone through every possible stage of reaction: denial, curiosity, suspicion, obsession, and finally, exhaustion mixed with anticipation. Because at this point, nobody was asking whether the situation was interesting anymore. They were asking whether the next piece of information would finally bring clarity or make everything even more complicated. And that's when the final shift began. Not with a public statement, not with an official confirmation, but with something far more powerful in the digital age. A sudden silence that felt intentional. For a brief moment, everything slowed down. The constant stream of clips, posts, and commentary stopped updating at the usual speed. Even the most active accounts seemed to pause. And in that silence, speculation grew louder than ever. Because in viral environments, silence is never empty. It is always interpreted. Some said it meant legal caution. Others said it meant internal tension. A few insisted it meant something bigger was being prepared behind the scenes. But no one could prove anything. And that uncertainty made the situation feel heavier than ever before. Then came the moment that reignited everything. A new piece of content surfaced, brief, unclear, and immediately controversial. It wasn't a full statement. It wasn't a full video. It was fragments. Screenshots, cropped clips, partial audio, edited sequences stitched together in a way that made interpretation almost unavoidable. And that was the problem. It didn't explain anything. It suggested everything. Within minutes, the internet split into multiple competing interpretations again. One group said it was meaningless noise designed to restart attention cycles. Another group said it was the missing link they had been waiting for. And a third group didn't take a position at all. They just watched, convinced that something was about to break open. As the content spread, influencers rushed to respond. Some tried to dismiss it immediately. Others analyzed it frame by frame, slowing it down, pointing out pauses, gestures, and timing. And suddenly, every second of the clip became a battlefield of interpretation. What one person saw as coincidence, another called intent. What one person saw as editing artifacts, another called hidden meaning. And once again, nothing could be agreed upon. But the emotional intensity kept rising anyway. Then came the second wave, far more disruptive than the first. Old content started resurfacing again, but this time with a different framing. Not new information, just old moments recontextualized. And that recontextualization changed everything. Because once people start viewing past events through a new lens, the entire memory of the narrative shifts. A conversation that once felt harmless now looked strategic. A timeline that once felt stable now looked curated. And a public image that once felt clear now felt constructed from carefully selected pieces. But the most important development wasn't what people were seeing. It was what they were starting to believe was missing. Because by now, the audience wasn't just reacting to what was visible. They were actively searching for what wasn't. And that search is where narratives become uncontrollable. Every unanswered question became more important than the answers that already existed. Every silence became more significant than any statement. And every contradiction, no matter how small, became part of a larger imagined structure. Then, without warning, a new rumor began circulating. Not detailed, not verified, just a short claim repeated across multiple posts in different forms. It suggested that there may have been earlier internal awareness of growing tensions long before the public conversation began. No evidence was provided, no source was confirmed, but the timing of its spread made it impossible to ignore. Because it arrived right after everything else had already been destabilized, and in that environment, even weak signals feel amplified. That's when the narrative reached its most unstable point. Not because anything was proven, but because too many competing interpretations existed at the same time. Some people believed the entire situation was overblown and built on recycled speculation. Others believed the volume of contradictions pointed to something deeper that had not been fully understood. And both sides were growing more convinced, not less, which meant no resolution was coming, only escalation. And then came the final moment that shifted everything into cliffhanger territory. A new statement, or what appeared to be a statement, began circulating late at night across multiple platforms. It was unclear where it originated. It was unclear whether it was complete. But it referenced prior discussions indirectly, in a way that made people believe it was responding to the ongoing chaos. And that alone changed everything again. Because now it wasn't just the internet talking about the situation. It was the situation seemingly talking back. The reaction was immediate. Screenshots flooded timelines. Breakdown videos were uploaded within minutes. Live streams began analyzing every word, every pause, every possible implication. And the audience, already deeply invested, locked in completely. Because this felt like the turning point. The moment where everything either becomes clear or becomes even more confusing. But before anything could settle, something unexpected happened again. The content began disappearing. Posts were deleted, links stopped working, re-uploads were taken down or replaced, and suddenly the conversation itself felt unstable. Not because people stopped talking, but because what they were talking about kept changing or vanishing. And that created the most powerful emotional trigger of all, urgency. Because now, viewers weren't just following a story anymore. They were trying to keep up with it, trying to capture pieces before they disappeared, trying to understand it before it shifted again. And that's where the final cliffhanger locks in. Not with a reveal, not with confirmation, but with a question that now sits at the center of everything. If so many pieces are changing, disappearing, and being reinterpreted in real time, what version of the story, if any, is actually real? And more importantly, who controls what the public gets to see next? And just like that, you've reached the point where this story doesn't end. It just opens up more questions. Because whether you believe the official version, the online discussions, or somewhere in between, one thing is impossible to ignore. People are clearly seeing different realities from the same set of events. And that's exactly why this situation keeps spreading. Not because there's a final answer yet, but because everyone thinks they're missing a piece of the puzzle. Now, I want to hear where you stand on this. Do you think the internet is overanalyzing every detail and turning normal moments into something they're not? Or do you think there are still unanswered gaps that deserve a closer look? Because right now, the conversation isn't slowing down. It's splitting even further in real time. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and be specific. Don't just say what side you're on. Tell us why you see it that way. That's where the real discussion starts. And if you've been watching this unfold from the beginning, you already know this isn't just another trending topic that disappears in a day or two. This is one of those situations where every new detail changes how people interpret everything that came before it. So if something new comes out, or if another detail resurfaces, we're going to break it down together again. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next update, because the next layer of their story could shift everything again. And if you're new here, this is exactly the kind of deep dive breakdown we do. Taking viral stories, breaking apart the noise, and following the timeline as it develops. But I'll leave you with this final thought. In a world where information spreads faster than verification, the real challenge isn't finding what's true. It's figuring out what's being misunderstood in real time. And sometimes, those two things look almost identical until much later. Like the video if you want more breakdowns like this. Subscribe if you want to stay ahead of the next update, and I'll see you in the next one. Because this story definitely isn't finished yet.